Welcome to Asia Society. My name is Philipp Ivanov, and I'm the Chief Programming Officer and a Senior Fellow here at Asia Society. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special conversation with the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Enrique Manalo of the Philippines, on the rules-based order and what it means for the Indo-Pacific region and the world. Now, today's conversation is a part of the program of events with world leaders visiting New York for the United Nations General Assembly. And it's an opportunity for us and for you, for our community here in New York, to hear from the world leaders from the region. And we are very grateful for the opportunity to host them here in our building. Today's program will run a little differently, as you can see from the setup. We wanted to make it as interactive as possible, so you have an opportunity to interact with our guests, ask your questions, and hopefully we'll have a fruitful and productive discussion. The way we're going to run it is a conversation between our own Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy and former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Russel, who is one of America's leading diplomats and thinkers on Asia, and he will have a conversation with the Secretary. And we want you to participate, so the way it's going to run after some initial questions and answers, if you want to have a question, please lift your name like this, and Danny will call on you to pose your questions to the Secretary. Before we start the conversation, just some acknowledgements, of course. I'd like to thank you, Secretary, and your team, both from the Permanent Mission and from the Consulate and the Embassy, for finding time in your very busy schedule this week to visit us and to spend some time here. Secretary has had a long and distinguished career of over 4 decades in the Philippine Foreign Service, and he served as Undersecretary for Policy twice, as a Principal Advisor to the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He had many other positions in the Foreign Service, including as a Permanent Representative to the UN, and he also held positions of Ambassador to the United Kingdom and Belgium. Events like today, of course, are possible thanks to many of you in the room, our members, our supporters, and friends and partners. And Asia Society has a long history of hosting Filipino leaders and promoting a better and deeper understanding of Philippines in the communities that we serve, and we now have 16 centers across 4 continents. Just in the last decade, we've hosted in New York, of course, last year, your President Marcos. We had former Vice President Leni Robredo, Secretaries of Foreign Affairs, including late Albert Del Rosario, which we talked about a little earlier. And we also are focused on promoting Filipino culture and art. And in 2015 and 16, we hosted this incredible exhibition, which we called Philippine Gold, which was very, very unique and very successful. We also focused on young leaders, and in 2018 we hosted our Asia 21 Next Generation Fellows Summit in Manila as well. And of course our commitment to Philippines is also reflected in the fact that we have a center in Manila that's very active, and we are very pleased that our activities there are growing. So if you are not a member of Asia Society, this is really the best day to join, and we have our staff that can help you do that. We feel like never before our mission of promoting deeper understanding of cultures and people and institutions in Asia has been so relevant to the world that we live in now. And you know, our work in this building is really to help interpret and understand these changes that are happening in Asia. And so I hope you can join us, have a look at our website, sign up, being a member, join our events, subscribe to our newsletters, and just get involved, because it's really important that we all build this institution and this community as well. So Please make sure your cell phones are silent, and that's all from me. Thank you for joining us today, and over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks for all of you for coming. I had the pleasant, great honor in the past of working with Foreign Secretary Enrique Manalo when he was the permanent secretary and the senior official representing the Philippines in ASEAN, and we dealt not only on bilateral issues but also on the whole range of ASEAN-related issues. So it was a thrill for me when he became the secretary, and it's an even greater thrill to welcome you here today. Thanks very much. Why don't I dispense with the introduction and give you the floor, and then we'll have a chance to chat. And then it's very important to open the floor, to turn this into a conversation, not a lecture. And we've got some wonderful people here, so I'm sure they'll have great ideas and great questions for you. But please, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Danny. I'll start off with some remarks as a way of background, and I'll try and leave enough time for an interactive discussion. So first, let me acknowledge Ms. Deborah Eisenman, the acting president, Mr. Danny Russel, vice president, International Security and Diplomacy, and Mr. Philipp Ivanov, thank you for the introduction. Distinguished experts, members and partners of Asia Society, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really very honored to join you this morning for this conversation, and I think what has become more or less an annual tradition of Philippine leaders and foreign secretaries and other senior officials speaking here at the Asia Society, especially during the high-level week in the UN General Assembly, which we are now in. So I really appreciate this opportunity to speak before you this morning. Now, last year, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Visited here too, and he also, in his statement in the General Assembly, issued a call for unity of all nations who meet the critical challenges that we're facing in the world today, especially during the post-pandemic recovery. He spoke of a foreign policy of peace and a global rules-based order with the international law as the foundation of dealings among states. And as a maritime and archipelagic nation, the Philippines counts on the rule of law, especially law in the oceans and seas, to preserve peace and stability. And Philippine diplomacy has also helped shape the 1982 UNCLOS with our contribution to the archipelagic doctrine, among others. The 2016 award on the South China Sea arbitration definitively settled the historic rights and marine entitlements in the South China Sea. And that has also been a bedrock of our policy in our region, especially in the South China Sea. And in fact, for the past 7 years, we have been commemorating this award because of the importance we attach to it. The Philippines, as you are aware, continues to face challenges to its sovereign rights and jurisdictions in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea. And recent incidents have illustrated the challenges we're facing. For example, last August, there was the water cannoning incident to one of our Coast Guard vessels, as well as quite often dangerous maneuvers made by the Coast Guard and maritime vessels of one of our neighbors, as well as harassment for our resupply missions on the Yungan Shoal. These have threatened the safety of our personnel and also have challenged our efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to our Marines, for example, in the Yungan Shoal. But more importantly, the almost daily harassment or challenges to our efforts have also affected the livelihoods of Philippine fisherfolk. So this is also something connected very much to our ability to benefit from the resources in our exclusive economic zone. Nevertheless, we are committed to peace and diplomacy and the rule of law to settle differences and disputes. and we are going to maintain this approach. And this has also been a period where our alliance and comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States has been growing. And working together, including with other like-minded countries in our region and in other regions, we hope to certainly build up a strong foundation for cooperation on the basis of international law. During the visit of President Marcos earlier this year to Washington, D.C., our leaders, President Biden and President Marcos, considered various steps to ensure that our alliance and partnership remains relevant and responsive to the current and emerging realities in our region. And this includes cooperation in not only in defense, but in economic areas. So just allow me to summarize 3 points. First, our economic cooperation with the United States should keep a pace with our defense-related activities. And in this regard, we aim to increase two-way trade and investments, especially in critical infrastructure and strategic and sensitive sectors. And one area is on critical minerals, where we also hope to increase our cooperation. And we anticipate the arrival of the first ever U.S. presidential trade and investment mission early next year to coincide with the Philippines' hosting of the Indo-Pacific Business Forum, which we hope will foster public and private partnerships, as well as generate big-ticket projects in priority areas. Secondly, the Philippine-U.S. partnership should also continue to support the Philippines in enhancing our defense capabilities and building a credible deterrent against challenges to our sovereignty and territory, as well as improve our overall capacity to protect our national interests. And the Philippines, of course, is as all other countries, aiming not only to enhance our let's say, traditional security areas, but also our economic security and economic resilience. As you're also all aware, earlier this year, the President made the important decision to announce 4 additional EDCA sites where both Philippine and U.S. forces have access for the conduct of joint activities, especially training, exercises in connection with humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And in fact, just last week, the Philippine-U.S. Mutual Defense Board and Security Engagement Board, led by the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, met in Manila to finalize plans and proposals for various types of marine domain awareness and intelligence sharing activities. Another point and last point I want to stress is anxieties on geopolitical tensions should not detract or prevent the region from the pursuit of economic prosperity and development. My region, Southeast Asia, is currently ahead of the global curve in post-pandemic recovery, and we are committed to maintain this momentum. Now, beyond the region, of course, we have the new complexions in the strategic environment, which really require all countries, especially the Philippines and U.S., to work together more closely in various domains, and not only in terms of marine domain awareness, but other areas such as artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, cyber, and space. But more importantly, and I'll repeat again, we need new rules to ensure that these new emerging technologies are not weaponized or misused in any way to subvert the rule of law or to challenge the rule of law, and to not be used to exploit the vulnerable or violate the human rights and human dignity of peoples. So let me just end my brief remarks by saying that we also know that governments on their own cannot solve all the ills of the world, nor can they on their own really promote full and lasting peace and security. We need to have the help and partnership and active participation of civil society, including organizations such as the Asia Society. And we value very much our working together. And I also count on the support of Asia society as the Philippines navigates our path towards greater political and economic resilience, and as an equal partner for the U.S. in building a safe, sustainable, and rules-based order in our region and the world. So thank you very much, and now I'm ready for your questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. That's a great overview, and you raised a lot of issues that I want to discuss further, and I'm sure others will want to ask you about. But can we start with the bilateral relationship, which you touched on? And not only did you touch on it, you've lived it. You've engaged not only through important changes in government in Washington, but also pretty significant changes in government and an approach in Manila as well. So what's your sense? How would you characterize things right now in the U.S. Philippine relationship? What's going on? What's important? What's next?
Well, I think Philippine-U.S. relations have really made a dramatic and significant, let's say, have improved significantly, let's put it that way, in the past year. I mean, really significantly. Our partnership has been enhanced in so many areas, and especially in the defense, security, and in the economic area. And I think this is best illustrated by the number of official visits, not only on at senior level, but at high level. The president has made a successful state visit to the United States, and then Vice President Harris came to the Philippines, and I myself, with my colleague from the Department of Defense, had a 2+2 meeting in Washington in April. And in all these meetings, which turned out to be very successful, we discussed so many areas of cooperation and potential cooperation between the United States and the Philippines in defense and security, but even more importantly in the economic area, where we have felt from the Philippines that perhaps our relationship with the U.S. should really focus a lot more on economic cooperation. And I mentioned earlier the cooperation not only in traditional trade and investment areas, but new areas, including in critical minerals, strategic infrastructure, etc. And so what I can simply say is that if our relationship with the U.S. now is probably in a scale of 10, probably 9 point something. But anyway, and we're aiming to get to the 10 fairly soon.
Well, I don't take it personally that you say that after I left government, U.S. Philippine relations have dramatically improved, but I get it. So we'll come back to the econ side because that is very important. But in terms of defense, you alluded to this, and I've heard President Marcos talk about the need to enhance the alliance to be better prepared to deal with emerging challenges and threats and so on. I know that, as you mentioned, Admiral Aquilino was just in Manila, and there's a lot going on. He, in fact, alluded to the prospect of even greater access for U.S. forces in the Philippines. But on the security and defense side, where do we want to grow? What does it mean to expand and enhance the alliance? What's the direction of the future as you see it?
Well, I think from the Philippine perspective, our main aim in trying to strengthen the alliance with the United States is not simply just to, modernize our armed forces, but to give us a better and improved capacity to defend ourselves and our sovereignty. And I think all countries have that as a priority. And that's been our main goal on this in terms of our cooperation with the United States in terms of defense and security. But as I said, this has to be linked also to economic cooperation and economic security. So we're really viewing this as a way of not only improving our relationships with a traditional ally, but ensuring that the Philippines also is able to on its own, improve its capacity to defend itself and also to provide security to our people.
So to me, the most sort of dramatic point of intersection between the security agenda and the economic agenda, as you're describing, is the maritime domain awareness. The ability to harness technology, including overhead satellite technology, to get a handle on what exactly is going on in your exclusive economic zone. I've never done a comparative study, but the Philippines is such a dispersed nation. You've got so many islands. You do have a really huge exclusive economic zone. And so keeping track of who's fishing in waters that by rights belong to the Philippines, who's doing surveys in the seabed, who's mining, kind of who's digging a hole in your backyard, so to speak. That's huge. It's both a matter of national security and it's a matter of economic livelihood. So since I kind of left the movie, what's been happening in terms of maritime domain awareness, and are you able to tap into some of the resources that the U.S. has been trying to build in the entire region and for the Philippines specifically?
Well, as you said, Danny, the maritime domain awareness is one of the key areas that we always mention and discuss with partners, and not just the United States, but even other regional countries. And I think as you mentioned, one of the key areas there is not only having discussions on rule of law, et cetera, but actual intelligence sharing and I think also the greater use of photography in the area, so we have a much greater idea of what's going on. And this is where we also attach importance to, and this is what normally when we have discussions, we say that cooperation in these areas is very important and helpful. We have to know what's going on every day in our exclusive economic zone, and this can only be done by sharing of intelligence and similar types of arrangements with other countries, especially our partners. This includes not only the United States, but also Japan and Australia. We've also been entering into discussions with them, and these have been very helpful. They've enabled for example, our assets in the South China Sea, like the Philippine Coast Guard, to have a better understanding of what the situation is on a daily basis. So this is also an important part of our cooperation. It's not simply on traditional areas such as military equipment or supplies, but this type of intelligence sharing.
So building on the economic point, talk a little bit about, you alluded to the economic relationship. I think our two-way trade is past the $20 billion mark. What's going on? And what is this IPEF thing that I keep hearing about? What does that mean for the Philippines?
Well, in principle, the IPEF is an important step towards, let's say, enhancing the footprint of the United States, but also the other Indo-Pacific countries in terms of greater cooperation in certain areas. But let me just say that at the moment, to be fairly frank, the IPEF is really more now still of a political document. I think what the next step is to see whether actual activities can be undertaken in the context of the IPEF. But I think it's an important step because it shows now the commitment of those who are participating in the IPEF to, let's say, embark upon economic cooperation activities, not only the Philippines and the U.S., but all those who are participating in the IPEF. So it's really an effort, at least the beginning of an effort to create a footprint, an economic footprint of the United States and the other countries in the Indo-Pacific working together. I think one of the weaker points in our relationship with the United States was on the economic front. We felt that there was so much more we could do there and not just focus on defense and security. Mm-hmm. So I think the IPEF is in many ways, as we interpret it, a step in that direction.
And I'm interested in your reference to critical minerals and strategic infrastructure. Can you give us a feel for sort of what does that mean in practice? What does it look like to build out those activities?
Well, I could just use an example of the area of critical minerals. For example, in the area of battery supply chains is where we're looking at. And there is a model for us. It's the agreement between the U.S. and Japan on critical minerals. And we're very much interested in that. And there are also, because we'd also like to build on the presence of mining firms in the Philippines and others, as well as even countries outside the region to produce, for example, battery components. In other words, we want to increase the manufacturing in the Philippines rather than simply export our minerals to other countries. We would like to keep them at home and encourage investment in the manufacturing sector so we can produce the components in the Philippines using our own minerals. And I think this is in line now with our efforts to provide not only economic security but economic resilience. And in many ways, a type of de-risking because we're now producing it in our own country rather than exporting the raw materials to others. And I think this is an approach being done by many countries. And there are other raw materials such as in copper and nickel, where we're also looking at. And nickel has many uses, so it's we say why export it when we can produce the products at home. But we would encourage foreign investment, of course, to help. So those are examples of what we mean when we say greater cooperation and critical minerals.
So speaking of cooperation, you mentioned Japan as an example. The Philippines and Japan have a very strong bilateral relationship. So expanding beyond just your neighborhood, I saw there was an upgrade in Philippine-Australia relations. I forget exactly which rung on the ladder you're in, and with the UK as well, an enhanced partnership, that kind of stuff. What's going on with the Philippines' other relationships, not outside of ASEAN and beyond the bilateral U.S. Philippine relationship?
Well, we've been fairly active. I mean, aside from our closer ties with the United States, but don't get me wrong, we also have good relations with China. But I'll maybe get to that.
Yeah.
But we have certainly, let's say, enhanced our relationship with a number of our partners in the region. For example, just 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Australia visited the Philippines, and we signed a strategic partnership agreement with Australia. We have a strategic partnership now with Vietnam and with Japan, which has always been a close partner of the Philippines, both economically and security-wise. We are in the process of negotiating an agreement similar to the status of forces arrangement that we have with Australia and the United States. So in those areas, in our region, we have, in effect, been getting closer to our partners, and we all share the same approach: the need to work together, like-minded partners, in the face of this significant geopolitical and geoeconomic changes. But this is not only limited in our context to our regional partners. We're also opening up ties now with the EU. They were moribund for a while. But just last month, the President of the European Commission visited the Philippines, and she had talks with President Marcos Jr., and the EU now is ready to resume scoping talks and eventual negotiations on a Philippine-EU free trade arrangement. So that's been a major step, and we also benefited from the fact that the EU now is more or less let's say, on the GSP, has reinstated it again for another 3 or 4 years. So that's for the EU, but also with individual EU countries. We have, like Germany and France, we have stepped up our economic collaboration with them, and even on security aspects, but more on, let's say, maritime domain awareness activities. And with the UK, the minister recently visited, the foreign secretary recently visited the Philippines, and we had a good discussion too on how we can collaborate more on economic cooperation and including defense and security. So what I'd say is that we are more or less embarking on a policy of, as the president said, independent foreign policy, and linking up more with our partners and like-minded partners, even non-traditional, because we realize we have to work together, not only in terms of addressing geopolitical issues, but even on global challenges such as climate change, where, by the way, the president will be attending the COP28, and I'm sure he'll deliver a strong message there on climate change.
So that's an incredibly robust agenda, and I'm sure it involves a lot of travel by you.
Yeah. Well, yes, it does.
All right. You mentioned China, and I of course want to come to China, and I know that China is uppermost on the minds of most of the people here. But before we do, there's something that Americans often skip over, and that can be pretty hard to really wrap our minds around, which is ASEAN. Even though I am a veteran of many ASEAN meetings, and there were times when I wanted to gnaw off my own leg to escape, the fact is I'm a huge fan of ASEAN, and I really think when you look at the region of Southeast Asia and take stock of the phenomenal diversity of kind of religious and ethnic and national backgrounds, when you look at the history of grievances and of disputes over borders and so on, the variety of political systems, it's a major miracle that the Southeast Asian region is at peace and is as unified and productive as it is. So I'm a fan of ASEAN in the abstract, at least. In practice, am I right in thinking that ASEAN is struggling? That particularly given the really horrific first the coup in Myanmar, but also the really heartbreaking human rights problems, the ongoing civil war. It seems like this is an issue that ASEAN has been, if not paralyzed by, at least been powerless to really resolve. Maybe that's unfair, but talk to us a little bit about how ASEAN is doing, where it is heading, and in that context, your thoughts about the Myanmar crisis.
Thank you. I'll try and be brief. Well, first, ASEAN is 56 years old, and we're actually now probably the second oldest, and we would say probably maybe even one of the most successful of the EU, maybe next to the EU of regional groupings. And I think that despite some of these issues which are troubling ASEAN, and I think any regional grouping always has issues to contend with, there's a real commitment on amongst the members of the ASEAN to proceed ahead. And in fact, we just recently at the summit adopted the ASEAN vision for up to 2040 on how to strengthen the ASEAN community. So there's a real commitment to stick together, because we realize, and in the context of the ASEAN centrality theme, we have to stick together. We have preserved peace within our region. At least there have been no wars among amongst us, and we have all developed. Maybe it's slightly different paces, but ASEAN is now the 5th largest economy in the world together. And I think we realize there are benefits by working together. And as middle power, middle income countries, we have a great stake in trying to preserve, by working together, preserving the peace and stability in our region, and a way preventing conflict between the big powers. Because in our region, almost all the permanent members are there in one way or another. So we have to ensure that the middle countries do not get trampled upon. And the best way is to work together in cooperation, of course, with all the other countries in the region. And I think this is recognized by all because, for example, in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, every year we have new signatories. I think now we have about 53. So there's a much growing interest for countries to deal with the ASEAN. And dialogue partners have increased. Most recently, our new dialogue partner, newest one, is UK. And Timor-Leste is on track to become the 11th ASEAN member. So I would say ASEAN is alive and it's kicking, and we're really determined to move forward. That doesn't mean, of course, that we don't have issues, and one of them is, of course, Myanmar, which you mentioned, and that has certainly been a problem. As I mentioned when I talked with you earlier, that ASEAN has taken some action, and one is to disinvite Myanmar from our summit meetings and foreign minister meetings. So they're not represented. It's to show our, let's say, well, it's to prevent us, ASEAN, from giving the military government some kind of prominence, and not to let it know that what it's done has been acceptable. To deal with the Myanmar issues, ASEAN adopted a 5-point consensus, to which the military junta agreed to. And in this consensus, the basic point is, to provide humanitarian assistance, but really the main aim is to get all the stakeholders in Myanmar to sit together and discuss how they can resolve the issues. Of course, that's the crux of the problem. It's not easy to get the stakeholders to meet. Nevertheless, ASEAN has appointed every year, the chairman has appointed a special envoy. Sometimes it's the foreign minister to go to Myanmar and see how we can implement the 5-point consensus. But let me just say that aside from reaffirming the 5-point consensus at the last summit, the ASEAN leaders also recognize that ultimately the solution to the issue in Myanmar is up to the Myanmar people. And only they can resolve their problems. But what we can do is to try and help them to see how they can do that and work together to achieve that. But that's a very tough problem. And I think it's going to be unfortunately, might be a long-term thing. But in the meantime, the people are suffering. The humanitarian situation is getting worse, and the conflict, in fact, in Myanmar is getting worse. So this is an issue that ASEAN really and our leaders contend with almost every time they meet on a daily basis.
Well, I'm being greedy by asking you all the questions, and I haven't given people a chance to engage directly with you. So please, everyone who wants to ask a question, raise your placard, and I've already lost track of the sequence, but I'll do my best. That said, I am a greedy person, and one last issue to put on the table is the other big problem that ASEAN is grappling with is the South China Sea, and particularly China's blatant disregard of both the ruling of the international law, the Sea Tribunal in 2016 that granted stunning endorsement of the Philippines' position, but more broadly, the predatory fishing, the militarization of outposts, and the insistence that what used to be a 9-dash line, now a 10-dash line, In other words, that the entire South China Sea is essentially a Chinese lake. So talk a little bit, if you would, about this issue and where it might be headed.
Thank you. Well, I think Danny more or less summarized the issue. And I think that is the big challenge we're facing. And just to put it in raw terms, is the fact is that we need to benefit from the use of our exclusive economic zone. But unfortunately, we have been unable to really realize the full potential simply because of the presence, and I'll say because of China. Of course, there are other claimants, 3 other countries, but China is, of course, the biggest in its activities. It's even getting more assertive and aggressive in the sense not only in terms of reclamation, but as I mentioned earlier, affecting our fishing folk, who are sometimes harassed and prevented from undertaking activities which they have been doing for centuries in that same area. The militarization and of the area by China's use of gray zone tactics, actually, in enhancing their presence there, and as you can see in the recent incidents, when we were trying to resupply with food and water our Marines on our ship in the Ayungin Shoal. Twice this year, 2 incidents have occurred of which gained international attention. The first was the use of a laser beam on a supply ship, and just last month the use of water cannon and against one of our Coast Guard vessels. So, these are incidents, as a president, even when he talked to the Chinese ambassador, mentioned that, we want to be friends with China, we want to settle our disputes peacefully, but you're not making it easy with these incidents. And that's the point where we've been making to them. And, we have mechanisms with China on South China Sea. We have, in fact, a bilateral mechanism to discuss every single issue in South China Sea. That's been there for 5 years, and it still meets. But progress is slow. So these are the issues that we are contending with on an almost daily basis. And it's something really of concern, but we are, as I said, we are determined to try and resolve them peacefully and through diplomatic means.
Thank you. And there's no more graphic manifestation of what the rule of law means than the ruling of the law of the Sea Tribunal. Well, I think Sydney and Sean were first, if I got that right. So why don't we take 2 questions at a time, please? Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Sydney Jones from NYU and a little think tank in Jakarta called IPAC. And I was just in the Philippines, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of Filipinos don't believe that the EDCA agreement is largely about disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, and that the Chinese are seriously irritated by that agreement. And the question is, in addition to maneuvers in the South China Sea, how else do you think the Chinese are going to respond? Because there are a couple of possibilities. One, that they intensify their charm offensive in Indonesia, because Indonesia wants to stay neutral in the U.S.-China relations. A second issue would be to increase the number of Chinese in the Philippines. It's already the case that the majority, not the majority, but a large number of the FOCAP members, the journalists, are mainland Chinese. And a third possibility is that the Chinese government could make, could support the Sulu Sultanate as a way of needling the Philippines government. And there's some BARM officials that are actually trying to exploit this to try and get Chinese support for the Sultanate. So how do you think China will respond?
Don't give Beijing too many ideas. One more question, Sean.
Speaking of relations outside ASEAN, how big of a deal was it that your tribunal award against Beijing was mentioned in the U.S., South Korea, Japanese trilateral statement at Camp David?
That's a great question. So, what do you expect from the Beijing in response to EDCA, and how did you react to the Camp David reference?
Yeah, on the first part, well, the minute we announced the 4 new sites on EDCA, China immediately raised it, and I even met with the foreign minister, the former foreign minister of China, and they raised it. But, that's been one of our issues, that the fact that the EDCA, we tried to explain to China and to other countries, it's not aimed at China. It's purely something that the Philippines has done in order to bolster its national security or national interests, as well as cooperating with the United States. In fact, this has been one of the issues. I think many countries face it. China tends to look at any activity that a country makes in its own prism of U.S.-China rivalries. So they're always, in fact, they were not blaming the Philippines, they're blaming the United States with it. And everything we do, it's the U.S. behind it, when it's not. We simply agree to it because it's in our own interest, our own national interest. It's not aimed at any particular country. It's aimed only at the Philippines and improving our interoperability with the United States. I think we can't jump to any conclusion on the use of these EDCA sites because there has to be a mutual agreement between the Philippines and the United States on how the site will be used and the type of supplies coming in. And I think we just have to believe that really it's aimed at providing a possible site for cooperation in dealing with humanitarian and assistance and disaster relief in the area. And that's how it stands. And I haven't read anywhere in any document where it says it's going to be aimed at something else. But anyway, there has to be agreement on its use. What China will do, I don't know. They definitely don't have a charm offensive in the Philippines. I'd be happy to get that, but so far we haven't. But I know Indonesia and China have been talking. In fact, in the ASEAN, there were some efforts by Indonesia to get some agreement on some issues, but other ASEAN countries had difficulty, and this was mainly on China's effort to regarding the Shanfis, right? The Southeast Asia nuclear. They wanted to, and I think there was an effort to get China to sign it. But in some cases, we wanted China to make a declaration of the non-use of nuclear weapons in writing, which they haven't done. But anyway, that's still a work in progress. Yeah, I do. Well, China, of course, there are many Chinese coming now into the Philippines, and that's not gone unnoticed. And many of them are working on a number of the projects. Landmark Glacier, which, by the way, the one in Manila Bay has been temporarily suspended. So I think that's not gone unnoticed. As for the BARM, well, I don't know. I have to. We of course work closely with the BARM officials. So and so that's why I think we would probably know of if anything untoward happened there. But I at the moment, I mean. I can't speak for what's going on there, but definitely. So that's my response to that. Yes, on the Camp David, we appreciate very much the support, public support of governments for our efforts or for the what's going on in the South China Sea, especially the arbitral award, and not only that, but also when the recent incidents happened, the ones I mentioned, a number of countries came out. In support, or in criticizing China for their efforts. And in the arbitral award, I think over 20 countries now have come out. And I think it's really in the context of the realization that international law and respect for international law and a rules-based order is really becoming more and more important in today's world. And this, for example, even in the Ukraine, it's now being realized by other countries on why the UN Charter is so important today and international law and respect for international law. So yes, we welcomed that.
Beautifully said. Thank you. That's such an important point. Well, Anne Marie, I saw you put up your placard, and Rory and Jessica. Let's take 3 questions. I don't know why all the questions are on this side of the table, but there's got to be a reason.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I was hoping I could get you to expand a little bit on ASEAN and Southeast Asian states and the South China Sea. As you know, countries aligned with China, like Cambodia, have for many years prevented ASEAN statements from including opposition to things such as China's gray zone activities in the Philippines and others. And yet, what we saw just a week or 2 ago is ASEAN holding its first ever naval drill in the North Natuna Sea. So this is a bit of a contradiction. So I'd be curious to know what you think this move, if anything, signifies for the future. And I'd also wonder, we've seen the Philippines and Vietnam take quite a number of cooperative steps on the South China Sea. Do you envision greater cooperation with like-minded Southeast Asian states outside of ASEAN? And how might that proceed? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you, Emery. And Rory Daniels is the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute and a wonderful colleague. Please.
Well, thank you, Secretary Manalo, for your time and your comments. You gave us such a fantastic tour of the Philippines' relationships with U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your relationship with India, and particularly how you see the Quad grouping, India, United States, Japan, and Australia, working with Philippines on some of its strategic priorities.
Question. Jessica.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for those wonderful remarks. It was really, really informative. And I think my question kind of relates to Rory's. So I'm asking this question from my experience working with the U.S. Department of Defense with different alliances in the region over the last few years. And I'm curious, we have a number of groupings, whether it's the U.S. bilateral kind of hub and spoke system of alliances, AUKUS, and then also some of the partnerships that you've discussed in the defense sector. Do you ever see that some of these growing partnerships, will we ever go towards a more collective, operationalized, institutionalized kind of cooperation, with the comparison being towards a NATO type structure? And do you see a need for that?
3 big, great questions.
Yes, definitely. Let me first start then with the ASEAN and South China Sea and how we approach it, and also the reference to a naval drill. Well, I'll just say that that's one of the beauties of ASEAN. See, you can never. That's how we managed to survive. So we take decisions by consensus, and sometimes decisions which somehow we seem to contradict each other. But anyway, but they still manage to make us work. Yes, well, in ASEAN, ASEAN is always in their main statements at the foreign minister level or leaders level, has always come up with language on the South China Sea. But it's also carefully negotiated. Countries are not mentioned in name, but if you read it carefully, there are references to what's going on. So that's how we managed to get an agreement on language. Not the best. For example, in the Philippines, we would have wanted much stronger language, but then some didn't want any language at all. So we have to come up with a text. And, that's how you get the negotiations and get agreement. But there's always been language on South China Sea and what's going on, because it's not only the Philippines, there are other claimants too there who have been affected. Of course, there are other countries who feel that maybe we shouldn't mention. So, but anyway, let me just say that there always has been language, and only once, I think in 2013, where they were in Cambodia, there was a problem. But ever since then, we've always come up with some language. Now, on like-minded states, outside ASEAN, from the Philippine perspective, yes, we are on issues of South China Sea. That's probably one of the key issues that we always talk about. and see what we can do with each other. For example, in the case of Australia and Japan, it's also part of our discussion, even with Vietnam. And in terms of Vietnam, as I mentioned, we have now a strategic partnership with Vietnam. And we're both claimants, but I think our understanding is that we have to settle whatever differences we have, for example, in the South China Sea peacefully, and then focus on greater cooperation, not only economic, but also in defense. That's with Vietnam. And the same with Australia and also with Japan. So we are working with all the countries in the region. And I think one of the issues binding us is the situation in the South China Sea and how we can work together, the like-minded partners, through various means. On India, yes, in fact, I visited India 2 months ago for consultations. And I have to say, we were pleasantly on the South China Sea was discussed, and for the first time, India supported the arbitral award. I don't know if they missed the language there, but they adopted it, and so we were surprised. So that's I think India is also now moving much closer to our region. They want to have a greater involvement there, and not only with the Philippines but also ASEAN, and we're encouraging them because we think India is a big power there, and it has an important role to play in our region. And we have Philippines and India have also been growing. Our cooperation has been growing, and we've made a commitment to enhance it further. So, in other words, India is also very much in our sights for enhancing cooperation. Yes, the Quad. Of course, we're not a member of Quad. We're watching what Quad can do, but we think Quad can play an important role in encouraging cooperation among countries in the region, not necessarily through simply defense, but serving as a symbol of how we can work together in various types of partnerships, and then we have the key countries in the region working together. So that's an important example. And that leads me to the next point on different types of cooperation. In fact, now the Philippines, U.S. and Japan are exploring trilateral cooperation. We in the Philippines are quite open to these to minilateral types of arrangements. We have also with Australia and Japan. They're not formal arrangements, but we're cooperating together. And I think what I have to say is let's see how it works, because now sometimes we even have difficulty in agreeing on the agenda for the meeting. But let's see how it works, and let's see where it leads. But the important thing is the political will to work together, and not aimed at any particular country, but aimed at improving our capacity to cooperate more closely, and not only bilaterally, but trilaterally and even quadrilaterally, if that's possible. So I think that's the way it's going. It's in its early stages, but I think we're meeting more and more now, these various groups. And even the other day, I had a consultation in the UN with 3 countries. So that's the first time I've ever had that. And it's not easy discussing with 3 countries, but there are efforts now to work in that kind of a format. Thank you.
Well, my apologies. I know there are more questions that we won't be able to get to, but the Secretary is going to be speaking tomorrow at the UN General Assembly, so you'll get a second crack at hearing what he has to say. These were really great questions and great answers. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for sharing your time and for sharing your thoughts, which were candid as always and very, very clear, very insightful. I'm sure that you feel that here you are among friends. We love the Philippines. We love Enrique Manalo. And we're so glad to have you come and talk to this great group. So please join me in thanking Foreign Secretary Manalo. Thank you.